The year is 2025, and stereophonic recordings have a complete monopoly on the music both being released on a corporate level as well as a home recording level. And frankly, I've had enough of it. So this video is going to be monothematic, where we strictly talk about releasing your home recording music in a monophonic format. A quick YouTube search shows that there's no other recording engineer YouTube videos out there talking about releasing your song as a monophonic recording. Instead, all the videos are monotypical in the sense that they are talking about having a stereo mixdown and using a mono playback as a tool to make sure there's no phase issues, to make sure the song can play on a mono system, and to check for EQ problems that you may have. This video is not about that. It is strictly talking about a mono mixdown. And I know what you're thinking right now. The last time you thought about mono was when you kissed your cousin in the basement in the 6th grade. But if you're a fan of this channel, you know that there are some pretty awesome home recordists out there releasing their songs in a monophonic format. Yeah, all kidding aside, although I do love my mono mixes, I do have a bit of monophobia, and I do wish that there were other people out there releasing their music in a monophonic format, because I think it could be really fun, and in certain circumstances, actually fit the song better than a stereophonic recording. So let's talk about the reasons why you might do so now. Now, while I do know that a majority of people aren't like me, and most of the music they listen to is not from the 1920s to, say, August 8th, 1968, I do know that a lot of musicians out there like to draw influences from the earlier eras of music. And while making your mixdowns monophonic isn't going to make your listener think your song sounds vintage, it is certainly going to be a lot easier to get there than, say, if your mixdown was stereophonic. Let's take example, you're trying to go for a 1940s Patti Page type of sound on a 78 record. You are certainly never going to get there if your mixdown is stereophonic. Now, it doesn't all come down to trying to sound vintage, right? When your mixdowns are monophonic, it is going to subconsciously let your listener know that your song is less produced than it would be if it had a stereophonic mixdown. And this could really work in your favor if that is a stylistic change that you want to make. For example, let's take the most obvious example here. Let's say you're recording a punk rock band in your untreated basement. They're half drunk. The screamer's singing into the mic. You might want to choose to do a monophonic mixdown for a song like that. You want it to sound raw. You want it to sound dirty. You want it to sound like it's right in your face. If you had a stereophonic mixdown for a punk song like that, it might take the listener away from that because it might sound a little more produced than it should be. Now, you could apply this to many different genres, many different thematic purposes of the song you're going for, but a monophonic mixdown can certainly help you get there to a less produced, less polished sound. The next topic I want to talk about is playback systems, and I think a majority of the YouTubers out there talking about stereo mixes get this part completely wrong, because I kept hearing over and over again when I was watching these videos that your listener is going to be listening to your song in a stereophonic setting, and I cannot disagree more. I honestly think it's a mixed bag whether or not your listener is going to be listening to your song in a mono or stereo setting. Gone are the days of a hi-fi system where people are taking records, sitting in their living room, and listening to the record in a controlled manner. That ain't happening these days anymore. Let's take all of the common examples of how people are listening to music nowadays. Bluetooth speakers. Either your Bluetooth speaker is going to have one speaker where it sums the signal from your left and right and plays it as a mono source, or your Bluetooth speaker is going to have two speakers. However, since you're listening to it at a distance, 5 feet, 10 feet, and those speakers are so small, by the time it gets to your ears, it's going to be mixing as a monophonic signal anyway, and they're not going to get that stereo separation that you were hearing in your recording room when you were doing your stereo mixdown off of your monitors. Let's talk about even in a car. Now, in a car, they're going to be listening to your song in a stereo setting. However, there's going to be a slight limitation there. Let's say you're in the driver's seat. You are going to be hearing the music from the left speaker, the left channel, a lot louder than you're hearing from the right channel because this is at a different distance. You're actually going to be getting an uneven playback level of the stereophonic source. Now, it's not enough to notice. However, it's something to consider if you're, really particular how you want someone to listen to your mixdown. Now, let's take the extreme example of a cell phone here. Now, this is bad for two reasons. Most modern cell phones are going to have a bottom speaker as well as a top speaker. And for the reason I mentioned before, if you're listening to your phone and it is an arm reaches away, these speakers are so small and close enough together that by the time it gets to your ears, it's as if you're listening to a mono source anyway. To make matters worse, in some situations, and listen, I know I'm on a monologue right now because I've talked about this before in my videos, but just bear with me here. This cell phone, an example, in particular, the cell phone I've had for a long time, the earpiece speaker is completely different construction than the bottom speaker, and because of that, they have completely different frequency responses in their playback. And one of the first mixdowns I ever did, I realized how big of an issue this really is. The song I was working on had a slide guitar as a lead part on the left channel, and when I played it back for the first time on my cell phone and hear what it sounded like, I could barely hear that slide guitar coming out of that little tiny earpiece speaker. And from that moment on, I thought twice about making a stereo mixdown ever again. I didn't want to be in a situation where I worked so damn hard on a mixdown and someone listened to it on a crappy cell phone and they couldn't hear half of what I was trying to get them to listen to. So, funnily enough, these constraints were very similar constraints that recording engineers were working with back in the Dizzy, right? Go back to the 1950s and the 1960s when people were listening to music in the car where they had one singular speaker either in the dashboard or in the rear seat, right? Recording engineers had to think of this limitation even if they had the ability to make stereophonic mixdowns in the recording studio. They had to think about how someone was going to be listening to it on the AM radio, an AM radio that has a monophonic playback, right? So you have to think about this, right? Not everyone's going to have the ability of or be listening to your songs in a stereo setting. Really, the only controlled setting I can think of anymore that people listen to music in a stereo setting is with earbuds or over-the-head earphones. And honestly, that's becoming fewer and far between. The average listener is not listening to music like that. Now, you have to make a compromise here. Maybe you don't care about the average listener. You want someone who really cares, a really avid music listener who has really nice headphones to listen to your song in a stereophonic setting, and that's just fine. It's just another thing you want to think about when you're making your mixdowns. All right, next topic. I talked enough. I know a majority of the people watching this video record in a DAW, but humor me for a second. In the analog realm, you are going to be subjected to the equipment limitations that are set forth by what equipment you have. And for me, when I was first doing the mixdowns for my album Distorted Proportions, I was mixing down my songs from my 16-track to my 2-track machine, and I was unhappy with the frequency response I was getting with my 2-track machine, so I wanted to apply an EQ curve to my songs. At the time, the only EQ I had is this one here, this graphic equalizer, and this is one I found in the trash. It is terrible, but it was all I had at the time, and specifically I wanted to boost the high end when recording onto the 2-track tape. And because this is a one-channel graphic equalizer, I was not able to do stereo mixes. So early in that process of making that album, I said to myself, both from a stylistic choice as well as a equipment limitation, that all my mixes for the album were going to be monophonic. It was only later I was able to get this stereo parametric EQ that allowed me to do stereo mixdowns. Your limitations are not only going to be set by your equalizers, it's going to be seen in all of your equipment. Most obvious examples are with compressors. If you want a stereo mixdown, you're going to have a compressor that has at least 2 channels on it. More obvious example, which is going to be applicable to most people, is going to be with your microphones. Now, it was only up until very recently that I got my first stereo pair of microphones. Unsurprisingly, if you know me, it was 2 EV635As. But before this, I did not have a stereo pair of microphones. So I couldn't do a stereo overhead for my drum set. I couldn't do a stereo image on an acceptable stereo image on my grand piano. no stereo images. I could have panned, individual instruments, yes, but for a true stereo image, which is all the rage these days, it just was not possible with the microphones that I had. So for those reasons, you might not consider wanting to record in mono. You might just be subjected to recording in mono. All right, next. The next reason you might want to consider making a monophonic mixdown is simply for the challenge of it as a recording engineer. It is going to be a lot more difficult to get a good sounding mix to play back in mono as opposed to a stereo image. The relationship between your tracks in both the EQ as well as the relative volume are going to be way more important when you're mixing down in mono. Now all these instrumentations and track are going to be fighting for the same space on the same speaker. It is a lot easier to get the separation between instrumentations when you can physically separate them onto separate speakers. For that reason, I recommend, just as a challenge to yourself, even if it's not your final, mixdown, try to do your mixdown in mono and see where you could get. You're going to have to carve out the EQ a little bit better for certain instrumentations. You're going to have to think about your volume relationship a little more, and I think it's going to be fruitful for you to try this out, and don't automatically just instantly go to a stereo mixdown when you're mixing down your song. Try mono at first, try to go back to mono once you're in stereo, try everything, and try it good. Alright, next topic. The last and final reason I'm going to suggest recording down to mono simply comes down to going against the grain. And really, this idea came to me this morning when I was doing preparation for this video, and I was watching dozens and dozens of videos of people talking about mixdowns and stereo mixdowns, and honestly, I just got so tired of the same monotonous information that was regurgitated in all of these videos. There was zero variability. It was just assumed in every single one of these videos that it's the year 2025. You have stereo mixdowns. Your mixdowns are stereo. That's how you should be doing it. It was never questioned. Maybe you want to do a mono mixdown. And that bothers me because it's something that's so simple. Like, I'm not saying anything groundbreaking, right? I'm not just suggesting to record onto mix down onto mono. I'm not putting myself on some monolith like I just came up with the idea. No, this is basic stuff, but somehow in the vast videos of all YouTube, I couldn't find one video talking about something such as simple of a topic. Man, the music in today's age has just become so formulaic, and it's just the same stuff. If you had a record label behind you and you went into a bigwig recording studio and you told the producer, I want my music to be mono, they would literally start seizuring on the floor. They wouldn't even know how to handle it. They would be like, year 2025, I'm on a recording? It's just, I don't know, man. Listen, I could keep going on. I already used the word monologue. I'm out of mono words, monofilament, monogamy, mono this, hopefully you understand the point of this video. You might want to try a mono mixdown, even if you don't go with it. Just try it out. Try it out for one song. Try it out. You might like it. Might be fun. All right. As always, don't subscribe, don't like, don't comment. I'll see you guys next time. All right.